Hi, local main character Zep here, and I think just like the US Congress, Yu-Gi-Oh! Needs term limits. As far as I'm concerned, this picture and this picture are of the same thing. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a lot of old cards that cause problems, and prompting new cards that are better than them to try to replace them, which only leads to a lot of really power creep. One of the proposed solutions to walking back power creep is set rotation, which is the concept of getting rid of old cards so the new cards can be designed in a less limiting design space. The Yu-Gi-Oh! Community has mixed reactions to this, but I'm here to give you something of a case for set rotation and the specifics of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Issue. And to those of you who don't know a lot of card game terminology, I'm going to be talking a lot about card games, so turn back while you still can. It's a sad day when I have to talk about Yu-Gi-Oh! Again and the subject matter isn't Gozaburo Kaiba's Twink Death. Okay, card games.
Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a large intersection of issues, and while I do think set rotation is a solution, I do not think it is the whole solution. It's just part of one. I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a complex game. No, duh. Set rotation does not fully solve this issue, but it does quell it. Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards don't actually do that much compared to other games. They're just much less look-attable. They're displayed in such a format that makes every effect look like an incredibly intimidating run-on sentence at size 4 font. Yes, the cards are smaller than other games, and the text box is not that large, but those are really artificial problems. From the beginning of the game, the card template changed in response to the growing size of card text until they said, this looks good enough, and promptly kept it pretty much the same ever since. A tactic notably used in the state legislature of Oklahoma. Sure, the game uses the smaller, erroneously named Japanese card size, which it pioneered. So does Vanguard, and its cards are fine for the most part. I can pretty much tell what's going on here at a glance. I'm afraid of this one. While Konami has shown that they are willing to make an updated card border and then make changes to that border when needed in Rush Duel to very pleasing results, they refuse to do the same for Master Rules proper. I've heard some argument against changing the card border, stating it's classic and it would make new cards stick out, especially if they started doing full arts. That's why I collect all these cards, so they all look the same. Even if the card border were to change though, which I still think it should, the text would also need to be overhauled. Other games use shorthand, symbols, or even just formatting to make its text look clear. Konami has unfortunately not yet invented the Enter key. Luckily, some people bring up the fact that the OCG solves this text density problem. Unfortunately, they are lying and/or wrong. Yes, the OCG separated effects by numbering them, and yes, this is very good, but not good enough. This and problem-solving card text were steps in the right direction, but like any solution, they're still in need of work and further updating. This game is like a growing lobster that refuses to molt its shell and then suffers for it. Hell, even if you could parse what the card says, you still wouldn't be able to rule their effects in any satisfactory way. Did you know that Magic the Gathering, a game that is in many cases much larger in scale and complexity than Yu-Gi-Oh!, has a comprehensive rulebook for judges to consistently make calls on any ruling issue the game can present? Did you know it's over 300 pages long, and that's fine because it's mainly meant to be a lookup tool for official play and fringe rules judgments for judges? Did you know that Flesh and Blood, a much smaller game from a much smaller company, also has one of these comprehensive rulebooks, even though it is much newer than Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Magic the Gathering? Did you know that all of this is a problem? The only way Konami decides messy card rulings, like which permit simultaneous continuous effects get applied first, is by a case-by-case basis. While the OCG has a card rulings database with collected judge calls and word of God to help judges, the TCG has Googling different forum posts or letting a judge make something up. This is not good for a competitive game that relies on the consistency of its rules. How does your locals handle the terms that target those targets versus it or they them? Because those are all mechanically different things. Konami absolutely can make a comprehensive rules document that's better than the one that comes in structure decks, which counts as the official rule book. They are a big enough company with enough manpower. Don't think they can make rulings on every single card? They don't have to. They can make systems to regulate these interactions, like Magic's layer system. Players at locals don't need to know these complex rules, but when a judge call needs to be made, they can at least look it up in a consolidated form. You may think that having card rulings being based off of case-by-case precedent that may or may not conflict with the OCG rulings or rulings of similar cards or previous rulings of the same card may be fine. I mean, the US government judges by precedent, so you see the issue now. These are not problems set rotation can fix. They are their own issues with their own solutions. Yu-Gi-Oh's main issue right now is its lack of new player experience. They literally state this in their own shareholder meetings. There are tens of thousands of cards legal at a time, no good starting product, a ban list that drops randomly, and with semi-competitive decks costing about a month's rent, and the competitive ones cost about, I don't know, how many kidneys do you have? These are the kinds of problems that set rotation solve by limiting the card pool, tightening the game's design, and making all of the cards available, well, a lot more available. It's easier to get a card that came out a year ago than it is to get a card that came out 20. Especially when Konami just said at one point, what if we stop reprinting good cards? And while it would take a good team of designers to do so, set rotation can also step back the complexity of the game, arguably Yu-Gi-Oh's largest sticking point. Throughout the years, since cards aren't rotated out, it has forced the game to have cards that do more and more things, and usually more and more complexly. The game is shackled by its past game design decisions and needs to become simpler for new players to actually understand the game at a reasonable pace. And without a way to gradually introduce a cleaner slate while wiping the current one, that's not gonna happen. Without getting rid of the old complex cards, we can't bring in new streamlined ones. Trying to pull the game back to an Edison amount of complexity by simply introducing new cards and trying to ban old ones on some kind of ban list instead of a rotation would be like bringing in a 1920s boxer and having him face like a modern MMA fighter whose fists are made of guns. I do think it's worth going over how the game got to be like this and why its modern design philosophy is misled at best.
And now, for a brief history of Yu-Gi-Oh! None of the words that I'm about to say are even in this.
Yu-Gi-Oh! The official card game was a game designed in 1999 based on a highly successful Game Boy game that was based off of a highly successful manga series, and was partially distributed through booster packs and card vending machines. The rules were very different from what they are now. High-level monsters didn't need tributes to be summoned, you were limited to one spell trap activation and set per turn, and trap cards originally stayed on the field unless they said they destroyed themselves. It was not a good game, but was popular regardless because of a miraculous cocktail of market factors, including, but not limited to, the very popular fake game in the very popular manga that was its namesake. The fictional game it was based on was not exactly well designed either, because it was a one-off narrative tool that came back for an arc of its own due to fan demand. Magic and Wizards, or Duel Monsters, starting with the Toei anime and all further media because, you know, was just one of the many games of the week used by the homosexual hexing spirit inside of Yugi Moto to combat his Disney movie-esque comedically evil bullies and tormentors. The original Magic and Wizards chapter was literally Kazuki Takahashi doing a call-out post on this guy his friend met playing Magic. That walking call-out post, Seto Kaiba, came back by popular demand for his own arc that ended with a duel as the finale, which was popular enough in turn to make an entire arc about that card game. By the time this arc came out, card games had gone from an obscure enough hobby in Japan that Takahashi had to say it was only really popular in America, to being the popular hobby in Japan, partially due to the manga itself being a walking billboard for their existence. Bandai actually made their own Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game distributed in their card-s vending machines, which sucked, so Konami moved to get the rights to make Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards by developing a game game based off of the card game from the manga. Guess what they called it? Konami, already a grand sponsor of the Toei Yu-Gi-Oh anime, of course got the rights and had to develop the fictional card game that was once a Magic parody and then shifted to a Monster Collection parody. Shout out to my Monster Collection heads out there, with tabletop RPG mechanics to a cohesive card game. It took an incredibly long time for the game to get a solid identity mechanically, arguably only really striking something resembling its modern identity during 5Ds. Unlike Magic, which found an identity much earlier and therefore has had a somewhat better eternal format, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has been a 25-year-old thought experiment and has had cards that reflect that. It must be an excruciating process to design cards in Yu-Gi-Oh's current card pool because unfun power cards like Super Polymerization were made in a context where they were bad cards. At the time, fusion monsters usually listed specific material, and having a card that fused from both sides of the field would require your opponent playing a specific deck. That is not the case anymore. Old cards like this cropping up in Yu-Gi-Oh formats seems like it would be fun, but it's usually bad news because the designers back in 2002 to 2008 didn't think that special summoning would be such a big thing as it is now and would print something like the barrier statues. The cards that return from olden time usually serve to tell the opponent, hey, stop doing that thing that wasn't commonplace 20 years ago, but now is the whole game. I can't blame the people who designed those cards, because they clearly couldn't envision what the game is today, and I can't blame current designers fully either, because it's not like they can look up all of the 20,000 cards in the game and make sure all of the interactions with these cards are healthy for the game. And if the card isn't a game-breaking, no-fun floodgate that comes back 5-10 years after its release, it's going to be crept out of the game immediately and never see play ever again, even if they release really strong support cards for it, because, well, those aren't enough to justify volcanics. To sell new cards, Konami has to do ridiculous amounts of power and effect count creep. Being tied with an anime with flashy card effects for the longest time did not help this either. This would be less of a problem if instead of designing around tens of thousands of older cards that are from completely different and compatible games essentially, with a completely different design ethos, they could design a smaller, rotating card pool. It would be a much more flexible design space and would allow for old archetypes to be reprinted and be actually useful this time, instead of being given one good card that makes the deck okay, but not playable. Games with a rotating standard format are usually cheaper to play, unless if you're exactly Wizards of the Coast and wanted to kill your highly lucrative baby with a meat grinder. If you wanted to play the Pikachu game, a competitive deck usually costs less than $100 in many cases, sometimes being cheaper than $50, since they offer decks that are just a few cards short of being full power meta contenders, plain to buy on retail shelves. They also have a product that's, oops, all utility staples as well. The price being lower is also being helped by printing competitive cards in both lower and higher rarities. I mean, Yu-Gi-Oh does this in the OCG, but TCG Konami hates you and wants you to mortgage your house and sell your family's organs. They will build a tower to heaven made of money and tell God that he's going to be reprinted, but only in a secret rare slot. So, consider that. But for the most part, rotation does the heavy lifting in keeping a game accessible. The cards in play in such a format are the cards that are most readily available. There are no old cards that randomly pop up into play as must-haves, but only got printed in one set 10 years ago in a short run. Of course, people will complain that they can't play decks that are old favorites. Not like they can now. Have fun drawing that Blussy Machine Go against a deck that so far outpaces yours, it can get more done in a turn than you can in a game. You most likely play the deck casually, so whatever the official competitive rules are, you don't have to abide by them. There are no deck checks on the kitchen table. Also, set rotation would preferably be in conjunction with an internal format where every card is legal unless banned, so hopefully it'd be a non-issue. Some are worried that the value of their collection would be taking a hit, to which I don't care that much. This is a trading card game, so I think its validity as a game comes before its validity as an investment hustle. There will still be old chase cards collectors want outside of their competitive viability, and new cards will still sell. If anything, set rotation is easier to speculate for than a Konami ban list, which is both unpredictable and randomly occurring. I know the aftermarket is a big part of why TCGs get funded, but maybe Konami can start releasing worthwhile collector's product instead of just giving a competitive necessity a funny foil treatment that makes the already hard to digest card art impossible to see. I'd rather have a game that leans towards being accessible to play rather than lucrative for a small portion of people who invest in it. Saying this would get me blacklisted as a communist in McCarthy-era America. Look, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a lot of issues and needs a lot of diverse solutions to solve or even just improve on each of those. Set rotation is not an end-all, be-all solution, and I don't think anyone in their right mind wanting set rotation thinks that. It would simply allow the game to pursue new directions without having to print cards that curb stomp the existing card pool at an unsustainable rate. The game design could be more easily adjusted, and it desperately needs that. Old archetypes could get new support that actually works because they'd be injected into a controlled environment instead of being handed a band-aid after decades of being one-upped and stabbed by whatever prison shank the new meta deck brings to the table. And finally, the game would be at a price and scale for new players not to be threatened and inviting for returning players who need a new deck to play.
Of course, I've been oversimplifying. I could filibuster Congress for a matter of days about the origin of Yu-Gi-Oh! Alone. But one thing is for sure, Konami has to do something about their game. With a format using cards from a ban list from 2010 being one of the most popular in recent memory, maybe limited card pools aren't that bad of an idea? Or at least, I don't know, not printing cards like a Rise Heart. Even a better idea, just print Rush Duels in the TCG. The 7 stub is over. They are about to do Go Rush. They are behind on almost 4 years of cards. Rush Duels made it into Duel Links before it made into TCG paper, so... Oh, sorry, excuse me, I have to take my daily dose of copium? Yeah, no, I see Rush Duels being out by this summer.